The Reserve Bank of India, the country's central bank, finds itself in a legal battle. It faces a contempt plea in the Supreme Court. At the heart of the matter is the accusation that banks continue to charge interest on interest during the COVID-19 moratorium. This practice, the plea argues, directly contradicts the Supreme Court's earlier order. The court had directed banks to waive such charges to provide relief to borrowers during the pandemic. The case has garnered significant public attention. It raises critical questions about the RBI's role in regulating banks and protecting borrowers' interests. The outcome of this case will likely have long-term implications for the relationship between the central bank, commercial banks, and borrowers. It is a test of the judiciary's power to hold even the highest financial institutions accountable. The plea contends that the RBI failed to enforce the Supreme Court's order. It alleges that the central bank did not take adequate measures to prevent banks from levying interest on interest. This inaction, the petitioners argue, constitutes contempt of court. The case has brought the complex issue of compound interest into sharp focus. It has also ignited a debate about the fairness of banking practices, especially during times of economic hardship. The outcome of the case is awaited with bated breath by borrowers and the banking industry alike. The COVID-19 pandemic wreaked havoc on the global economy. India was no exception. Lockdowns and business closures led to widespread job losses and income disruptions. To cushion the blow, the RBI announced a moratorium on loan repayments. This relief measure, implemented between March and August 2020, was intended to provide temporary financial respite to borrowers. The moratorium allowed borrowers to defer their loan repayments without their accounts being classified as non-performing assets. This meant that borrowers could postpone paying their EMIs without impacting their credit scores. The move was welcomed by borrowers, offering them a much-needed breather during uncertain times. However, the moratorium did not mean a waiver of interest. While borrowers could postpone their EMIs, interest continued to accrue on their outstanding loan amounts. This accumulation of interest, known as interest on interest, became a point of contention. Many borrowers, already struggling financially, felt burdened by the mounting interest. They argued that charging interest on the accumulated interest during a period of unprecedented crisis was unjust. This sentiment fueled public discourse and eventually led to legal challenges. In March 2021, the Supreme Court delivered a landmark judgment on the issue of interest on interest during the moratorium period. The court ruled that charging compound interest during this period was dehors the intent of the RBI circular. This meant that banks could not charge interest on the accumulated interest for the 6-month moratorium period. The court recognized the financial hardships faced by borrowers during the pandemic. It held that charging interest on interest would defeat the very purpose of the moratorium, which was to provide relief. The judgment was hailed as a victory for borrowers and a significant intervention by the judiciary in the realm of banking practices. The court directed banks to refund or adjust the interest on interest charged to borrowers during the moratorium period. This order brought a wave of relief to borrowers who had been dreading the additional financial burden. It also sent a clear message that the judiciary would not hesitate to intervene in matters of economic justice. The judgment had far-reaching implications for the banking sector. Banks were now tasked with identifying and refunding or adjusting the excess interest charged. The order required a comprehensive review of loan accounts and recalculation of interest, a process that involved significant logistical challenges. Despite the Supreme Court's clear directive, allegations emerged that some banks continued to charge interest on interest during the moratorium period. This alleged non-compliance led to the filing of a contempt plea against the RBI in the Supreme Court. The plea argued that the central bank had failed to enforce the court's order and ensure that banks complied with the judgment. The petitioners contended that the RBI, as the regulatory authority for banks, had a duty to monitor their compliance with the Supreme Court's order. They argued that the central bank's inaction in preventing banks from charging compound interest amounted to a deliberate disregard for the court's directive, thus constituting contempt. The contempt plea placed the RBI in a difficult position. The central bank argued that it had issued circulars and guidelines to banks, instructing them to comply with the Supreme Court's judgment. However, the petitioners maintained that these measures were insufficient and that the RBI had not taken adequate steps to ensure actual compliance by banks. The case brought into sharp focus the RBI's role in regulating the banking sector and its responsibility to protect the interests of borrowers. It raised questions about the effectiveness of the central bank's supervisory mechanisms and its ability to enforce its directives on commercial banks.